Now keep in mind that when they were turning these by hand back in the early 20th century, they were turning steam locomotives, not the diesel locomotives. And steam locomotives, on average, weigh just about 200 tons apiece. For example, the 4501 that's going to be pulling this back weighs 215 tons. Now, this locomotive right here is the 606, built in 1954 by General Motors Electromotive Division, or EMD, for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, which is more famously known as the Milwaukee Road. It is classified as an SW1200. The SW meaning switching. It was built for switching service, moving freight cars around in the yards. And the 1200 meaning that 12-cylinder engine produces 1200 horsepower. Now, we acquired the locomotive in 2015 from the United States Navy, who owned it at the time, and was located in Crane, Indiana. Once we got it here, we restored it back to operation, and we've been using it here ever since. Now, as you spin around, if you take a look up in the cab there, you'll see our engineer, Tyler. He is responsible for operating the locomotive and getting us here safely today. So everyone give him a wave once you can see him. Now, while commonly referred to as a diesel locomotive, the correct term for these engines is actually diesel-electric. Meaning inside the engine there's a large diesel motor turning a generator. That generator produces electricity, and that electricity is fed down to the traction motors that sit on each axle of this locomotive. And it's those traction motors actually propelling the locomotive, hence the term diesel-electric. Diesel locomotives have always been made that way, and that's the way they are still made today, whether it's Norfolk Southern, CSX, or Union Pacific. Those are all diesel-electrics. The major difference between the early diesel locomotives and the ones being produced today is that today's modern locomotives have computer systems in them, as well as produce much more power and are much more fuel efficient. Now, the reason these locomotives would go on to replace the steam locomotive boils down to just one thing, and that one thing was money. The steam locomotives were much more expensive all around. For example, the steam locomotives spent much more time down for repairs and maintenance, which cost more money. They had to spend quite a bit of money on lubricants for all these exterior moving parts on those locomotives. The crew members cost a lot more because you need 2 crew members in the steam locomotive, only 1 in diesel. And then, of course, the fuel for a steam locomotive was much more expensive as well. Now, a common misconception is power was a reason. Power is actually not a reason these steam locomotives were replaced. A good example of that is, like I mentioned earlier, this locomotive produces 1,200 horsepower. Now, the 4501 that's going to be pulling us back produces 53,900 pounds of tractive effort, which is the equivalent of about 2,500 horsepower. Diesel locomotives did not reach the 25 horsepower mark until about the mid-1960s. Now, a lot of you have probably seen our equipment and property before. We are very often involved in film productions and music videos as well. For example, we've been involved in music video productions for Johnny Cash and Josh Turner, and film productions such as October Sky with Jake Gyllenhaal, Water for Elephants with Robert Pattinson, Leatherheads with George Clooney, and most recently 42 with Chadwick Boseman and Harrison Ford. And just about every year too, there's a children's show out here filming episodes as well. Now, after we get the locomotive off the table here, we're going to go park it over in front of the shop. The 4501 is actually lining up to get hooked onto our locomotive right now. Now, before we head back, if anyone has any questions, feel free to come up and ask me at this time. I'll be happy to get those questions for you. For those of you that don't have any questions, you can start making your way back to the train for the return trip to Grand Junction. Please make sure you do return to the same car and seats you rode in on the way over. And, of course, if anyone needs to use the restroom, there are restrooms available in the depot right